I think we're ready to get on with the next session. My name's Dennis McDermott, and I used to be at Flinders, and I'm now at La Trobe University, so I'm back in Adelaide for a day or two. So I'm chairing this session which sees two particular case studies brought together in one presentation because they talk to each other. They talk to each other very significantly, I think. They're biting off two small measures: the Northern Territory Intervention, or the Northern Territory Emergency Response as it was called, and the COAG version of Close the Gap called Closing the Gap. And the lessons that can be learnt from both of those. And so I think we have, you haven't got it up on your screen, but the people involved were Tamara McKean, Matt Fisher, Toby Freeman, Belinda Townsend, Emma George, Sharon Friel and Fran Baum, involved with these two particular case studies. So I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Kaurna country today. My 12-year-old now is growing up in Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. I'd like to thank, well, he's not here, but Uncle Lewis's lovely welcome to country and acknowledgement that he talked about one of his aunties, and I'll touch on her briefly in my closing remarks because I think there's a bit of a clue in there for us of how we actually actualise some of this stuff. So, putting it all together, I'd like to call on Associate Professor Tamara McKean to kick us off, and the others will join in as we go. Thanks, Tamara.
Thank you, Dennis. As a collective, we would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We would also like to acknowledge the Yorta Yorta and Bangarang people as traditional owners of the lands around Shepparton in Victoria, where part of our research on Closing the Gap policy implementation was conducted, and we'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In addition, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of communities in the Northern Territory, in which events that are the subject of some of our research took place, as well as our range of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants. And finally, I would like to pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating here today and acknowledge our ongoing sovereignty and resilience. The CRE included a stream of work on Indigenous peoples and health equity, and you would have seen that in the way that Fran presented the original diagram from the grant application today. The research under this stream included two case studies, one on agenda setting in the Northern Territory Emergency Response, a policy of 2007 initially under the Howard government, and one on Closing the Gap policy, which commenced under the Rudd government in 2008 and has continued in various forms to the present. We have also undertaken cross-cutting research looking at how to integrate Indigenous knowledges in all of our research on public policy. And this work has included the development of a discussion paper and reflection tool led by Dennis McDermott, and the development and publication of a framework to assess cultural safety in public policy, led by myself and Matt Fisher. So today we're going to look at the lessons from each of these case studies in turn, and then conclude with some thoughts on how to build cultural safety within the current political and policy implementation environment. The two areas of policy we've studied are part of a long history of colonisation and discriminatory government policies, which are underlying causes of the health inequities affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. These policies have been met at every stage by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's resistance and attempts to reclaim their rights as First Peoples. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders have repeatedly presented positive proposals to governments for substantive change, which have all too often been ignored or lost in implementation. However, over time, these persistent efforts have led to some important gains in public policy as well, and it is important to recognise and build on these achievements. Some of the more recent events highlighted in yellow in the political history of Australia that we will refer to, you can see on the slide there. Before I hand over to Toby, I would like to just read this quote from one of our participants in relation to the case study on the Northern Territory emergency response. We have a long, proud history of advocacy, and any gain First Nations people had is as a direct result of our advocacy. That's the let 'em off running through the struggle with a capital S. And each generation have taken up that cudgel and taken it just that little bit further. And this was a really powerful quote, which was a theme throughout both of our case studies. So I wanted to share that with you before we started to look at the case studies in detail, and I'm going to hand over to Toby first.
Thank you very much, Tamara. And I'll go through the details of the Northern Territory Emergency Response case study, and it really shows, I think, the truth of that quote. I'd like to acknowledge the people who helped with this case study, so Tamara McKean and Dennis McDermott, as well as Sharon Friel and Fran Baum as directors, and Belle Townsend and Connie Mussolino as well put in a lot of the hard yards of the work on this. So we were interested in three different perspectives: the Little Children Are Sacred report released by the Northern Territory Government, the Northern Territory Emergency Response done by the federal government, and then the alternative plan that was put forward by the combined Aboriginal organisations of the NT. So we gathered 72 media releases covering these three different perspectives between the release of the Little Children Are Sacred report and the passing of the Northern Territory Emergency Response legislation. And we presented that at the last CRE event. So this time I'm mainly going to focus on the 21 interviews that we've conducted with actors from the Northern Territory Government, from the Little Children Are Sacred report, from the federal government, from actors involved in the alternative plan and other experts and stakeholders. And 8 of those 21 interviewees were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with it, this is the timeline that we're interested in the policy agenda setting period. And it really began in May 2006 when Lateline began a series of reports on child sexual abuse of Aboriginal children in the Northern Territory. And I do acknowledge that this is sensitive terminology and material we're dealing with, but as you'll see, it's quite important to be clear about the language because it was very much weaponised as the intervention went on. So this reporting put a lot of pressure on the Northern Territory Government to do something, so they instituted an inquiry which was then led by Rex Wild and Pat Anderson. They produced the Little Children Are Sacred report and submitted it to Claire Martin, the then head of the Northern Territory Government, in April 2007, and then it was released publicly in June. It was immediately condemned as too soft by the federal government and by conservative commentators. And so in an incredibly swift turnaround, you saw Mal Brough, the then Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, announce instead a federal intervention in the Northern Territory to address the issue. And the Northern Territory Emergency Response was announced. You then had a period of time where the combined Aboriginal organisations in the Northern Territory came together. They started by writing an open letter that was signed by 140 individuals and organisations and made public that criticised the nature of the Northern Territory Emergency Response. And then they developed an alternative plan about what could be done instead. But as we saw, the legislation passed the House of Representatives. There was a very short public hearing, Senate committee hearing, which the authors of the Little Children Are Sacred report were not invited to. And then the legislation passed the Senate. And you'll see on the timeline as well, we've included the fact that Howard very shortly afterwards announces that November 2007 election. So to start with the first perspective, the Little Children Are Sacred report, this was widely regarded to be very positive. It was seen to have gone through a very consultative process, that it was really high quality work that tackled a really, really complex area. and produced a very scholarly piece of work. One or two people we interviewed thought that maybe it was a little too complex, that 97 recommendations were perhaps a few too many. And then the main criticism came for the Northern Territory Labor government for sitting on that report for 6 weeks before they did anything, with the argument that that space allowed the federal government the fuel to criticise the Northern Territory government and to do as they wished. Others were very dismissive of this criticism, saying, well, how many government reports are sat on for way more than 6 weeks, or indeed sat on for forever? So not everyone agreed that that was a fair criticism. But what we reported in that framing analysis in the last CRE event was that Brough and Howard really used a discourse about the dysfunction of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in the Northern Territory. And what I think the interviews really clearly showed to us was that the dysfunction was in the workings of this white government. So the Northern Territory government were very much blindsided by the federal response. The story we got told was that the whole group of Northern Territory bureaucrats in a plane on their way to Canberra to finalise and sign off on acting on the report when they were told that on the ground Brough had actually just announced the emergency response. So it was very much a blindside. And we reported that later Howard admitted to Claire Martin that it was a purely political stunt. It was pure opportunism and nothing deeper than that. Brough, who was the key architect, was seen as a very ambitious man, very much wanting to be seen as the next Prime Minister. And because of that, that created a lot of rivalry with Tony Abbott, who had similar ambitions, and he was the Health Minister. And that meant that the Aboriginal Affairs Ministry and the Health Ministry were not collaborating anywhere near enough to produce good outcomes on the emergency response. He had an army background and he was seen very much as an army man who was given the green light by Howard to implement this intervention. And no one, while there was a sense that Brough generally wanted stuff to change in the Northern Territory, no one we interviewed thought that was actually genuinely what it appeared to be on the surface. And it was almost unanimous that the actual aim of the intervention was to get the government re-elected in 2007. This was their attempt at recreating the success of the Tampa incident. So lots of commentators have criticised the lack of a logic linking the contents of the emergency response to the problem. And I think the program logic is much clearer around a political stunt for re-election. And of course, in that sense, it failed. So it's a failure of an implementation in that sense as well. And of course, as we know, Labor supported the intervention. And this was largely put down to them not wanting to be seen to oppose measures. And luckily, they've stopped doing that tactic at every turn. But it was also because they believed in some of the philosophy behind the Northern Territory emergency response. And one insider pointed out that, that the Labor caucus generally had a view as well that if you could control people's income, if you could control their environment, then you could essentially discipline Indigenous people into being better citizens. And you can see that come through in the way that they actually extended the intervention under the Stronger Futures and maintained some of the really punitive negative measures. The other two motives that were raised as driving the emergency response was firstly a welfare reform experiment, not in terms of whether or not income management was a good thing to do. I think it's quite clear that it's not a good thing to do. I think what they were experimenting with was how much furor there would be around it. And since there clearly wasn't enough, that they've continued to experiment with income management, continuing to the present day. The other main driver is the desire of Brough and others to fix what they saw as wrong with the way Aboriginal affairs were conducted in the Northern Territory. So they'd previously attempted to get some reforms through and had failed, And so this gave them the opportunity in one fell swoop to regain control of everything they wanted to regain control of, so that they could do assimilation in their own way. Again, absolutely unanimously, people described how lacking in consultation this policy agenda setting period was, that it was incredibly insular. You couldn't get to speak to anybody. Almost nobody reported being able to speak to Brough or any of the bureaucrats involved. Nobody was interested. This was partly because, again, Brough was trying to sell himself as a future Prime Minister, this army man of action, and that doesn't involve consulting with others. He wanted to be the figurehead. And it was all very assimilationist and very warlike in how people described it. You know, one interview described Brough setting up a war room to implement the emergency response. And one interviewer commented on the lack of consultation and partnership. Well, you don't tell the enemy that you're going to invade. Aboriginal people and Aboriginal organisations were very much seen as part of the problem. Again, the discourse around the Northern Territory emergency response was how dysfunctional these communities and these organisations were. So when the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advocates for the alternative plan and the other activists tried to talk to bureaucrats, tried to talk to politicians, tried to talk to the media, they were met with complete disinterest because they had been painted as being part of the problem and not possibly part of the solution. And this was also very much coupled with large amounts of ignorance on the parts of the bureaucrats and others about what life was like in remote communities. So we had stakeholders that we interviewed who had good knowledge of remote communities talk about the amount of ignorance that was going around about how things would work on the ground. And again, that lack of consultation and partnership just meant that there weren't avenues to explain to them what they were getting wrong. While I was working on this, these two images came through my inbox in the same day. So the first one is Kevin Rudd offering to team up with Tony Abbott on Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, which just reminded me of all the jokes that went round when Tony Abbott was first made Special Envoy to Indigenous peoples about, you know, what did they ever do to deserve that, and haven't Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people suffered enough? And if you just contrast that with, again, the same day with Ken Wyatt and Pat Turner coming through with spearheading the Closing the Gap refresh with the partnership approach, I think to me was really quite stark. In that policy agenda setting period, one thing changed and one thing only, and that was the change from mandatory sexual abuse checks to rolling out child health checks. And that change was attributed to a wide range of different actors. Some people thought it was the advocacy from the combined Aboriginal organisations that made the difference. Others thought it was the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, or AMSANT, the Aboriginal Medical Services Association in the Northern Territory. Some thought it was Jane Holton or other government health bureaucrats, and some felt it was Tony Abbott who'd managed to make the change. So I think what we can conclude is that this was one horrible measure in a raft of really, really terrible measures, and perhaps it was the most egregious and the most impossible to actually implement and enforce on the ground, and that the advocacy against that one particular measure came from multiple powerful actors that managed to get it taken out of the final version of the policy. What also struck me in doing these interviews was the dilemmas that were then faced by Aboriginal organisations as it became clear that this was an unstoppable juggernaut. So they had to essentially decide whether to get involved and try and steer it towards a better outcome, or to say, no, this is terrible and we refuse to get involved. And I just really saw this source of distress and this form of violence, essentially, of these Aboriginal organisations having to make this choice, and what a horrible kind of image it was of not self-determination, like the illusion of choice, an illusion of determination when everything was, it was lose-lose, essentially. So this all happened over 10 years ago. So what are the lessons for future policy agenda setting? One of the clearest things to come through was a need for properly resourced structures for self-determination. Brough was one man, so who's no longer making policies, but that one ambitious army man managed to wreak such havoc because it fit within a narrative of white sovereignty, because there were not structures for self-determination in place to listen to alternative voices about this. And while there's plenty of advocacy on the ground from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations, there's a strong need to resource participation in political processes so that voice can properly be heard. A lot of interviews talked about, would it happen today? If now that we have people like Patrick Dodson and Linda Burney and others in Parliament, would it be as easy to get the emergency response through the government? So safeguarding that representation in Parliament and ensuring it's there in future parliaments is perhaps really important. The other really clear lesson coming out of it was the real importance of civil society and collective action. Even though the alternative plan wasn't taken up and very little dents were made in the emergency response as it was implemented, interviewers certainly felt that an alternative reality that didn't involve that advocacy from the combined Aboriginal organisations would have been a much poorer place to live in, or a much harder place to live in. That collective voice was critical in maintaining a sense of meaning and pushback from Aboriginal communities. And again, that sense that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been engaged in this struggle for a long time. They're very politically savvy, strong understanding of how to mobilise, how to strategise. All that's needed are those resources to properly contribute to political processes. So I'll hand over to Matt on that point. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Toby, and thank you all for sticking with us and keeping awake during the post-lunch period. I'd just like to add to earlier acknowledgements by recognising and thanking the Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative in Shepparton as a partner organisation on our research on closing the gap policy implementation in Shepparton on Yorta Yorta Bangarang country. And I'd like to thank Ms Hope Briggs from Rumballara as an associate investigator on the research. So we investigated the implementation of closing the gap policy from its inception in 2008 up to 2018. We used a variety of methods, including 4-to-4 interviews with key informants at national, state and regional level, around half of whom are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. The research included case studies of policy implementation in 2 regions, Shepparton in Victoria, which has a strong history of community-controlled organisations, and in southern Adelaide. And our PhD scholar, Ms Emma George, has been part of the team and investigated implementation of closing the gap policies on early childhood in these 2 regions. To conduct the research, we drew on Mason Jury's work on research of the interface between knowledge systems and theory on decolonising research methodologies. And to design research tools and analyse data, we developed and applied a framework to assess cultural safety in public policy based on the 5 concepts shown here. And Tamara will come back to this later in the presentation. And we also use theory on policy implementation. So the focus for me today is to look at some of the key findings and lessons for effective policy to close the gap. And firstly, we'll highlight some strengths and weaknesses in current closing the gap policy implementation, looking at these 3 levels. Firstly, at the political environment surrounding and shaping closing the gap policy, and then at national and state implementation structures and processes, and then at local and regional structures and processes. And I'll use some quotes from the interviews to illustrate some of the points being made as we go along. And then tomorrow we'll apply our cultural safety framework to examine how to build culturally safe policy within the current environment. Okay, so firstly in the national political environment, on some of the weaknesses that are occurring there. Government policies affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are commonly treated as a fit subject for contested, often polemical political debate by mostly white politicians and opinion leaders. And this debate is shaped by a whole range of factors, including the legacies of colonisation, differing political interests, the federal structure of Australian politics, political opportunism and the electoral cycle, as Toby just described, and by racist or deficit-based views of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But some of the ways that plays out in policy implementation, well, one thing is constant policy change and short-term linear thinking. And we see this within the life of closing the gap policy, as described in the first quote there. A second major issue is policy incoherence, where the aims and strategies of different areas of policy contradict one another. Closing the gap aims are undermined by other policies such as income management and justice sector policies contributing to high rates of incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And overall, the picture that we have is one of Australian governments failing to adopt a long-term systemic and partnership approach to change, despite the closing the gap framework. A strength in the national political environment includes the growing role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander political leadership in a range of areas, from constitutional change to policy advocacy to health policy. And this leadership is presenting values and ideas that challenge and counter the polemical, largely deficit-based narratives mentioned earlier. Ideas about shared sovereignty, empowerment, voice to parliament, makarata, truth-telling and self-determination. And we found that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders also consistently argue for a long-term perspective and a systemic approach. But the question of what that more systemic approach looks like in implementation is still unclear. And it's a crucial thing to get right, as indicated in the second quote here. So now we'll move on to talk about implementation structures and processes. One of the key points of weakness or limitation found in our research on the national and state structures of policy implementation is that mainstream departments and services in areas such as health, education, social services and employment are not doing enough to contribute to closing the gap targets. And interviewees also pointed out that compared with targeted spending, mainstream services account for the vast majority of public spending on social policy. So it's important that they are accountable. And the fact that mainstream programs in key areas such as health and education involve both federal and state and sometimes also local government highlights the need for an agreed national approach through COAG. Our second point about current closing the gap policy implementation identifies a strength, and that is that the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health sector demonstrates good practice in a range of ways. And in particular, we highlight the current partnership approach to national policy between government actors and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership in the NGO health sector. And the current National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan recognises culture as central to Indigenous health and commits to addressing racism in the health system. And an earlier piece of research that we did, which is mentioned there at the bottom of the slide, recognised that that was the first time that had happened in national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health policy. And it really did come about through a partnership approach in the policy development phase, which has now flowed on into implementation. The partnership approach also includes a long-term relationship between Department of Health and the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector. So that continuity has been very important. Recognising good practice doesn't mean that policy is perfect, but nevertheless there are important lessons here for policy in other sectors. Our third point on implementation looks at two issues which have mixed value for policy implementation. One is the closing the gap targets themselves, and the second is the practice of targeted funding. So on the closing the gap targets, firstly, some of our interviews saw the targets and the annual PM's report as being very important, useful for keeping Indigenous policy on the national agenda. And others talked about the limitations of targets being deficit-focused, not addressing goals of self-determination and empowerment, or lacking targets on issues such as poverty, housing or incarceration. From our research, we would say the current targets, well, they're not really the current targets anymore, but the previous targets were very easily taken up by government agencies and translated into top-down service interventions to fix perceived problems. What they haven't addressed are fundamental elements of representation and partnership in policy making, or the importance of community-led, strength-based approaches at a local level, which we think are just as important but may be harder to measure or even inappropriate to measure. On the question of targeted funding, our research doesn't question the value of targeted funding as being part of the policy mix. The capacity of Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations to deliver their comprehensive approach relies in part on targeted funding. But what we do see is the proliferation of many narrowly defined, often short-term, targeted funding programs across federal and state and territory governments. It's a key feature of the current implementation environment, and it creates administrative burdens and costs to service provision. Governments are also increasing their use of market-based approaches to funding, such as competitive tendering. And this sort of combination of implementation practices has a number of negative outcomes, which are shown on the right of the slide here. So coming now to the issue of implementation at a regional or local level, findings from our research highlighted the importance of strengthening community representative decision-making and control over policy delivery at a regional or local level. And there are clearly many examples of regional or local decision-making structures already in place and working effectively. And where this is the case, these structures provide many important benefits for policy implementation, as shown here on the left-hand side of the slide. But if policy is going to commit to some form of regional approach nationally, we heard a range of views about what that should or could look like. So that's a bit unclear at this stage, and if our findings suggest anything, it really is the idea that any imposed or uniform model should be avoided, as per the second quote there, and then that government should look to support bottom-up, place-based processes, building over time on existing community achievements, needs and priorities, and focused on strength-based strategies. Aboriginal community-controlled comprehensive primary health care services should be a key part of any local regional decision-making structures. And of course, those structures must be accountable and transparent both to government and to their communities. And finally, just on a point of weakness in terms, or some challenges in terms of implementation at a regional or local level. A strong theme in our research is that policy implementation at a local level, including the key role of ACCHOs, would benefit greatly from more simple, secure and flexible funding arrangements to implement strategies tailored to the needs and goals of particular communities and places. But the challenge there is that such change is difficult because government structures are highly resistant to change. Another challenge is to recognise that efforts by government agencies to engage Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander organisations and community members in policy through community consultations or shared decision making or funding may be well-meaning but can also make excessive demands on those organisations or communities. And this is especially so when the engagement may be coming from multiple agencies or different levels of government, perhaps without reference to each other. So governments need to be a lot smarter about how they engage communities. But communities with strong local governments and community-controlled services are better placed to navigate and manage these demands. So really, in summary, we think the pathway to better policy is to build on and expand some of the areas of strength I've mentioned and address and improve practice in areas of some of the weaknesses that we've identified. So I'll now hand over to Tamara for the final part of the presentation.
Thanks, Matt. In looking at closing the gap policy today and the political environment surrounding it, it is apparent that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership is being expressed in a variety of ways, resulting in new ideas, proposals for new structures and new approaches to policy implementation, building on those previous achievements. For example, we have the Constitutional Convention that was held at Uluru and the handing to government of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. My apologies. We also have the formation of a new partnership agreement on closing the gap between the Coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies and the Council of Australian Governments. And we also have the appointment of Mr Romley Mokak, the former CEO of the Lowitja Institute, as an inaugural commissioner with the Productivity Commission to develop an Indigenous policy evaluation strategy. There are many other structures, processes and organisations that we could name here, but unfortunately time doesn't permit. As we mentioned before, part of our work on the CRE, we've been developing and we've published a framework to assess cultural safety in public policy affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we've applied that in our research. The 5 main elements of the framework are reflexivity, dialogue, reducing power differentials, decolonisation, and regardful care. Development of the framework drew on cultural safety theory in healthcare, where the focus is mainly on relationships between individual practitioners and Indigenous patients. While individual behaviours and relationships are important in policy too, our framework and research highlights the need for structural mechanisms in order to achieve culturally safe policy. It also suggests that successful policy is most likely when all elements of cultural safety are addressed in a systemic manner. We'll now look at each of the 5 elements of cultural safety and consider the role of current and emerging structures to achieve positive change. We'll do so in the political environment as the main space for agenda setting and in the policy implementation environment. Key structures that are required but are yet to be developed or operationalised are highlighted in italics. Our framework suggests that reflexivity in policy requires acknowledgement of and accountability for the impacts of whiteness and privilege, as well as recognition of the cultures, capabilities and knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Looking at structures for reflexivity in the current environment, we see a lack of structures for governments collectively to be truly accountable for the impacts of institutional and individual biases, and for governments agencies to recognise a sense of control, strong cultures, Indigenous knowledges and strengths-based approaches as essential elements of effective policy. Considering what structures are needed to address these weaknesses, we would argue that the two key structures needed in the political environment are those we do not yet have. However, in the implementation environment, there are structures such as those named that are well placed to tackle these issues. In our framework, dialogue in policy requires enduring partnerships across the policy cycle between governments and well-resourced Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, and broad, timely consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Looking at the current environment, we see structures in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health sector that do embed a partnership approach, but more limited consultative structures in other sectors. In the political environment, the key purpose of the proposed Voice to Parliament, as we read it, is to establish a partnership approach to policy making across all areas of parliamentary and government business. In implementation, we have identified national agencies and mainstream programs in education, employment and social services as venues for stronger partnership structures to be developed. Cultural safety in public policy requires structural mechanisms to reduce the stark power differences between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Australian governments. In the political environment, we have seen coalition governments withhold political support for the Uluru Statement in fear of structures that would change the power relationship. The proposed Voice to Parliament would be a key way to redress power imbalances within the political environment of National Parliament and Federal Cabinet. We also see a lack of structures to empower community-led governance and Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, enabling them to exercise more control over how resources are used at a regional or local scale. This is a key element of implementation that the new COAG partnership will have to get right. The Murdi-Parky Regional Assembly in Western New South Wales is just one example of a successful regional governance structure representing the interests of 16 communities in that area. The Rumbalara Aboriginal Cooperative in Shepparton provides a wide range of culturally safe services, but also, just as importantly, acts as an expression of cultural identity and self-determination within that community. Decolonisation in policy requires support for self-determination and rights, valuing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and processes to address racism. Here, the Uluru Statement proposals for structures to undertake truth-telling and agreement-making are essential, but still missing in the elements of the political environment to recognise Indigenous rights. Treaty processes underway in some state jurisdictions are showing the way. In the implementation environment, we highlight the urgent need for a national approach to reduce the destructive impacts of policies driving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander incarceration, child removal, and compulsory income management, and to shift the whole trajectory of policy toward developmental, strength-based, community-led strategies based on principle of self-determination. Without such a change, the prospects for achieving durable gains in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing are very small. Finally, regardful care in policy requires services that engage with cultural and community context. that value Indigenous knowledge, provide culturally safe healthcare, support strength-based approaches, and address social determinants of Indigenous health. In the current environment, we see there are some structures to achieve regardful care, particularly the role of Aboriginal medical services and Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. However, the funding environment in which Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations in particular operate is often fragmented, competitive and insecure, and departmental governance is often top-down, prescriptive and deficit-focused. These structures set limits on the ability of Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations to deliver regardful care, especially in relation to strategies that are strength-based and address social determinants. In the political environment, a key role for a Makarrata Commission is to expose these problems and propose ways to embed regardful care in policy. In implementation, a key challenge of the new COAG partnership on closing the gap will be to establish national agreements to prioritise Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations as preferred providers in Aboriginal communities. The new Indigenous evaluation strategy should identify ways to value and assess strength-based approaches in the way policy is delivered. In conclusion, policy agencies and implementation are actually moving ahead of the agenda-setting political debate in achieving some elements of culturally safe policy. However, some structural elements of policy implementation needed for culturally safe policy are still missing or under-realised. New structures, such as the Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap between the Coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies and COAG, build on previous achievements and provide opportunity for positive change. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart proposes key structures needed to achieve and extend cultural safety in the agenda-setting political environment. Thank you.
Thank you to our three presenters for a really in-depth look at both those case studies and the overarching conclusions that are coming from it. Can I invite you, Toby and Matt, to come and join us? If I can get this. This is really helpful. It says next in green and back in red. See if I can work this. We've got about 12 minutes. We can talk, take questions and get some response from the panel of three here. And then I've got about 5 minutes to kind of wrap up this session. So do we have some questions over those three elements we've discussed in this session? Down here, please, Kat. Oh, over there. I can't see, sir.
Hello, I'm Marie. I'm from Flinders Medical Centre. A brief comment and then a question. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was actually given to the Australian people, not handed to the government because of the failure of previous things like the Yerkala Statement and the Barunga Statement to gain traction with the government. So as a people, we've been given this gift and asked to influence government. How would you suggest we can do that?
The Uluru Statement is very simple: voice, treaty and truth. I think that was the NAIDOC for this year. So I think what those things represent are the things that, you know, as a society we should be taking back to governments and really considering what our response, either as a people or from governments, means when we stand on a global stage. And how we want to be represented to a global community is probably something that's going to become more and more important over the next few years as the global community itself becomes more connected and you know, things are no longer able to be hidden in backyards it's all visible now. So voice, treaty, truth.
It seems to me that despite the actions of Malcolm Turnbull and subsequent leaders, the Uluru Statement has not gone away. It's not gone quiet as they might have liked to happen. It's still very much something that's driving the agenda, I think. But I think one other point is that I think it is significant that in some ways I think the new partnership that's been formed between the Coalition of Aboriginal Peaks and COAG in terms of the next iteration of Closing the Gap policy, I think is really, in a sense, reproducing there in terms of a national body to drive policy, a similar thing, sort of partnership agreement that's been working in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health policy. And to me, it's quite a momentous change. Pat Turner, on behalf of that coalition, wrote to the Prime Minister and said, do not go ahead with the Closing the Gap refresh new targets because there's no partnership agreement in place, and that was heard. So I think in those ways that agreement and the implementation environment is kind of running ahead of the politics, as Tamara mentioned. And I think we're going to see political leaders at some point turning around and trying to catch up.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi. Hello? Okay. Point 3 in the framework for how to embed cultural safety, etc., was to reduce power inequalities, which probably would apply to any of the social determinant issues more generally. So, in practice, how do we reduce these power inequalities?
Yeah, it's quite specific in cultural safety, which is developed for colonised First Peoples. So the main mechanism we have at the moment from a power space in the political environment is a voice to Parliament. We do not have our sovereign rights realised in this country. That needs to be taken up in a couple of different ways, through constitutional change as well as through agreement making and proper treaties. But at the issue that we also have to unpack is we have systems that are inherently power different. So this is where the decolonising component comes in, which speaks to directly and explicitly removing those structures and changing those structures. So changing our parliamentary decision-making resource allocation structures to include the sovereign rights of First Peoples of this country. It's really interesting, having taken that from a healthcare interaction space, to put that into a policy making space, because the experience of those structural power differentials are different in each of those levels, but they're born of the same thing. Until such time as we can evolve and mature as a nation and understand that we are a nation of First Peoples, Second Peoples, Third Peoples, Fourth Peoples, Fifth Peoples. We need a societal shift that is required in order for us to generate the kind of structural changes that we're talking about. But the main power differential is in about the decision-making and resource allocation, and that's reflected at the top as well as at the local level.
Thanks, Tamara. That was very well put. Can I just briefly add to that and say that in the health sector, when we're training health professionals, we talk about the key to understanding and shifting power differentials is first reflexivity. So people have to actually realise the power differentials are there. How to do that in a national stage is a bit more difficult, but I would suggest where our media are failing us in terms of being critical and critical in that really deep thinking way, social media is taking up the challenge. So there's a real role for social media there.
I just wanted to get your idea about accountability. There's the focus has been on, appropriate, policy development and appropriate ways to engage communities and, leadership at a national level. But in some areas, like the indicators are getting worse, the incarceration rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are getting worse, and there are other measures that are getting worse. I'm just wondering, in the research that's been done to date, if there was much discussion about accountability mechanisms on some of these, indicators.
Just in terms of the way when we analyse the interviews using the cultural safety framework, accountability kind of emerged as a theme that we didn't originally find in the framework. We borrowed from a healthcare context, and one of the key points of that people were making about a lack of real accountability, government accountability for the impacts of policies, was around this idea of constant policy resetting and a lack of accountability for the effects of that. But in terms of the current structures, I think the new partnership agreement on closing the gap will be establishing new targets, and I would hope and expect they'll be going a bit wider than the previous targets, and I would hope and I think it's fair to expect that they'll be holding state governments a bit more accountable around some of the specific things that they're responsible for, such as child protection policy and justice sector policy, which have been sort of gaping absences in the previous targets. So, and I think the new Indigenous evaluation strategy for policy is going to, I think you could not have a better person than Ron Mokak in that role, and I'm sure he's going to be raising these issues through the Productivity Commission as well.
I think that's one of the most challenging things, because there has been a vacuum of accountability. So it's not even like it wasn't there. It's almost like negative space, like a black hole, just sucking all evidence or any thought of having to be accountable, just gone. So it's almost like trying to stop that vacuum, as well as put the mechanisms in, because I think other mechanisms that have been tried have just been sucked into this vacuum of like an inability to have a sense of accountability to citizens, and we are citizens now. So these little things that reposition us in society, that they will start to make these issues of accountability more and more pointed and less able to be, pulled into that black hole.
Probably got time for one or two more questions. Well, let's thank our panel, and I'll... I've not got much I want to add. I'd like to pick up a couple of the quick points. Question about what's happening in the refresh of the closing the gap. I think a few of you have mentioned that, you just mentioned, Matt, the targets are going to look differently, and bring in some domains that have been ignored before. I think you mentioned, a few of you, that one of the key domains that's now going to be addressed is justice and incarceration and youth justice, families, racism, a whole range of things which communities have put as their priorities but hadn't been captured in the old targets at all, and particularly with the structures to get there. So that's a major challenge, a major move forward, I think. Look, a couple of things that came out of all those presentations, which I thought was interesting, particularly right from the beginning, where the phrase was used that the dysfunctional communities was a kind of a stick to beat Aboriginal people around the head with by the government of the time of the Northern Territory intervention, and yet the real dysfunction was in the white government. So what does that teach us about those machinations that were going? I think it's more than just political machination. At the time, I couldn't chase the quote up, but I think it should be attributed to Michelle Grattan at the time. She called the Northern Territory intervention and the subsequent Stronger Futures legislation as bipartisan paternalism. I think that she really summed up something there, and that's the problem we've been grappling with. Both parties, both sides of politics have been paternalistic, and beyond paternalism, we've seen punitive policy practiced and polished to a rather good hue, and controlling politics. And the quote you had up there about, was one particular interviewee was saying, it was about, and from the left side of politics, if we can only control these people, I'm paraphrasing here, then that's going to be a good outcome. Yet that's exactly flies in the face of what we know from the Sir Michael Marmots of this world and others. It's all about control. It's all about self-determination to bring about an effective response. Just going back to that point in the Little Children of Sacred document about how it was such high quality, but also seemed to be highly complex. And I think that even the one or two people said, well, perhaps that's not a very good thing, being so complex. Yet that goes to the nub of the problem of Indigenous issues. They are bloody complex. It's a truism to say these are wicked problems. And we know that wicked problems are not amenable to silver bullets. We have to embrace the complexity, turn towards that dissonance they create and do something with it. So in that sense, I've got to find my little spot here, and there we are. I've been schooled on how to do it, and I've slightly cocked it up, so here we go. Complex policy. This is called a Gordian knot, isn't it? How do you untangle, how do you unravel complex, wicked problems? And I'd like to think, when I'm looking at an image like this, that perhaps these are bureaucrats grappling with this, and there's one, or policymakers, they've got one strand here, so here it is over here, no, it's over here, and yet look at it, it's one indissoluble issue with many strands, many dimensions. And I want to suggest something like the Northern Territory intervention is a variation on our normal approach. When I say ours, I mean Australian governments of all stripes approach to Gordian knots, to difficult, wicked problems, is to just cleave through. You remember the original, I think it was a Greek myth, wasn't it, of the Gordian knot? And so they couldn't untangle it, so they just got the spear, the sword, and just cut through. But simple solutions, we know, don't work. So what helps us in the last couple of minutes to actually unravel such complex problems? And the solution, I believe, lies in Indigenous knowledges. So here's Uncle Lewis showing his string trick, or one of his string tricks, to Auntie Miriam Rose Ngumea Bauman. And as I was talking to him about before he left about the string trick, the thing with the string trick, it's not a child's thing. It's an educational tool. It's for making people stop and observe. They'll never tell you how the string trick is done. You have to watch until you know exactly what's going on. So Indigenous knowledge can actually assist us as an unraveller. There's millennia of actually delving into the way real complex things work. So you saw Auntie Miriam Rose there on the other side. She says Dadiri, deep listening, and that's just one of the many names to it throughout Australia. Aboriginal notions of deep listening is her people's gift, or our people's gift to Australia. That idea of listening in real time, reflecting in real time. Uncle Lewis says from his mob, he likes to think about this idea of doubly, seeing things in two ways. Imagine if we got that back into our political discourse or into our research, seeing two things at the same time. You see a mountain in front of you, what's on the other side of the mountain? You read a text, what's underneath the text? What's behind the presentation? He's saying, can we get that into our endeavours? It's obviously connected to critical inquiry, but it seems a little different in that even if these issues are contradictory, if they're disparate, can we hold them in purview at the same time? to get to this dynamic where the real world lives. This other notion, and Tamara and others talked to us about Mason Jury's idea of the interface of Western and Indigenous knowledges. This is a lovely, I think, variation or affirmation of that from Yolngu thinking. And in Yolngu, way up the top end of Australia, actually, this is a picture from the southern end of Australia. This is the mouth of the Murray, the Coorong, and the Yolngu idea of Ganma, which some of you will know, which is about where freshwater knowledge, which is construed of as Indigenous knowledge, meets the incoming saltwater or Western knowledge. What happens is that foam is created, and that foam is the new knowledge. And the idea is we can actually take the best of both these systems to create something new to get us out of our dilemma. That's the idea of Ganma. And I won't talk about many other ways of introducing Aboriginal values and notions. Such things as Napachi reciprocity come to mind. There's many ways we can introduce that to our processes. But I'll leave with this one because this one goes to the heart of what we're saying about accountability, I think. If we take this idea of all things are interconnected and therefore we have responsibility, accountability is more than what's written on the paper. It's taking personal and society and community and governmental responsibility for being proactive about people's health and well-being. It's stewardship. Thanks.
Thanks, Dennis. As we let the depth of those insights sink in, let's just take a moment to regroup in your chair, or if you want to get up out of your chair, let's just have a bit of a stretch. Stretch out without hurting the person next to you. Touch your toes if you can. Imagine the first 4 bars of your favourite piece of music, whatever gets you up and going in the morning or gets you to refocus at the end of a day, and just take a moment to recharge and to refocus back in the room. Don't leave the room. Feel free to find space by the walls or at least come on back in. And maybe think beyond these walls to that very beautiful image of the mouth of the Murray, or to whatever is the landscape in the country that has meaning for you, as we try and counter the environmental effects of the room that we're in. All right, look, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tessa Boyd-Kane. I'm CEO of Health Justice Australia, and I've had the absolute privilege of being a member of the Critical Policy Reference Group that's been advising the CRE for health equity over the past 4 years. And what a phenomenal legacy that we've had the chance to listen to and take in today from those 4 years of work. I want to extend, on behalf of myself and of Sharon Friel, our acknowledgement that we meet on Aboriginal land that was never ceded, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Professor Sharon Friel is the Director of Health, is Professor of Health Equity and the Director of Regulation and Global Governance, RegNet, at the Australian National University. And absolutely critically for today, she is one half of the dynamic duo that has been leading the CRE for health equity. And so Sharon is going to take us through what we've learnt about actions for health equity.
Oh, was that right? Yeah. Okay, so we might be sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, this is just all too hard, it's exhausting, it is really impossible to make the sorts of changes happen to the extent of change that is needed. And this was part of my job, but also what I hope you've heard from colleagues throughout the course of the day is actually change is possible. And I want to speak about that in relation to these 3 things in terms of what we've, I hope, demonstrated and learnt throughout the process of the Centre for Research Excellence on the Social Determinants of Health. So issues of data, knowledge and evidence, structure, agency, and of course power, fundamental to that, and then relationships and commitment. Oops, that would be the wrong one. So often in this space we see a lot of, I want to speak about the sort of the evidence and the research just for a second. So how many times do you go along to a conference or a workshop or something to do with a whole load of academics standing up talking about health inequities, social determinants of health? Often we describe the problem, and I hope what the CRE has demonstrated is we don't need any more describing of the problem. We have so much evidence about the problem. Stop it. The other part is, I think the field has evolved a lot and pointing towards what I've called here the policy prescriptions, the sorts of actions that are necessary or that could help address the social determinants of health and health inequities. And so I think we've got a really nice evidence base that has developed partly through the CRE, but really much more broadly. That really hasn't been the focus of our work, actually, is the development of policy prescriptions. So we've got an evidence base out there to speak to the sorts of things, the what needs to happen or what could happen, what should happen. But where we focused, and I think what you would have heard so far today, is this attention to the how. Why is it that we know that all these inequities exist? We know the sorts of things that needs to happen, that should happen. Why is it not happening? And I've called that the how. So you've heard colleagues speak about different aspects of this, and I'll unpack that in a wee second. So this is a plea, this is a call to any researcher in the room. We need more research on the how. Please do not focus on the why, and yeah, maybe a bit on the what, but please focus on understanding the how. So this is how we've done it, just to remind you. But also we've paid really an awful lot of attention to the structural drivers. Again, I would argue in the field of social determinants of health, both in terms of research, but then of course in terms of policy and practice, it is very easy to slip to the intermediary daily living conditions. That's important. I'm not suggesting that's not important, but we've got to keep attention to really upstream, and we tried, I think we tried very hard within the CRE. It's so important. If we're going to understand action on health equity, we've got to understand how to affect change in the structural factors. We did it through the policy cycle, and here's just putting together some of those areas, some of those policy areas. Fran mentioned at the start that we've just been involved in this meeting with WHO. They've just set up a department on the social determinants of health and health equity to a certain extent. Very exciting. Here's the World Health Organization about to pay attention to social determinants finally. And we spent a lot of time talking about what health services could do. That doesn't, I'm not suggesting for a second that health services are not important, but where is the attention from a global institution on these sorts of policy areas that you've heard from colleagues speaking about this morning? So again, advocacy for attention within the research world into policy and action for these sorts of issues. And then the question of evaluation, and we had a whole work programme around evaluation. These are just some sort of insights that have come out from that space. And I've sort of headed it, what we measure changes how we act, what we evaluate changes how we act. And what we've seen in the work package 4 is constant within that evaluation space, absolute losing sight of the structural drivers. Who in here, in this room, knows how to evaluate the structural drivers of health inequities? Have you seen a whole load of publications in that space? I suspect you probably haven't. Because it always shifts right downstream, because it's dead easy to get those measures. It's what's captured in our routine data systems. So understanding how to measure, understanding what to measure really matters. And also, of course, and it was picked up really beautifully, I think, in the remarks by colleagues in just the previous session, the sorts of questions that get asked, the sorts of measures that get measured, the ways the evaluation is even thought of is absolutely through a Western lens. And what we've been really, just beautiful discussions by colleagues there of the trying to think about, trying to broaden, particularly a white mind, to actually the plurality of knowledge systems. And you'll see that in the publications that have come out from colleagues who have just spoken of absolutely how to do that. So they're just some provocations of, I think, what we've learned within the research space that's really important for getting action into in relation to health equity. The second area that I want to speak about that we've learnt, I think, in the sort of high order way across the CRE is this issue of structure, agency, and the continuum of structure and agency. It's not an either or. I hope you heard from everything that colleagues have spoken about is every person, every institution has power. We have different types of power. We express it in different ways. There are structures that work to squash power among certain groups and certain individuals within society. There are certain ways of releasing power. And I'm going to speak about that. So there's this web of actors you'll have heard across all of those different case studies throughout the course of today. We've got the state and non-state actors. They're in different sectors. They're in health and other sectors. And there's a suite of public and private actors. So every type of actor is at play when you speak about action for health equity. And every type of actor has power. But there are many different forms of power. There's structural power, there's instrumental power, there's discursive power, there's hidden power, there's visible power. Depending what theory you want to use, we could go on, I could list you a whole load of different sorts of power. We are in the process of putting together a paper around power as it relates to health equity. So this will be coming out at some point. But what does that mean? So, of course, particularly some of the big private interests, the private actors, have very strong structural power. But not just the private sector actors, like some of the major, I would say the biomedical power brokers who are at those tables, who are constantly being invited to those tables, have strong structural power. In terms of instrumental, who is lobbying? Who has the ability to lobby? Who is even interested in lobbying? You heard from Belle, from Ashley about the trade paid parental leave. Who is there in the room? So really important that we understand this sort of instrumental forms of engagement that happen between different types of actors who have different interests. And then I think one of the most important types of power, particularly for those who are structurally weak, is discursive. So the narratives, the framings that we've heard across all of the different case studies today is using frames that both capture the imagination, that capture the hearts and the minds of the public, of the politicians, but that also challenge the dominant narratives that are in place. So learning how to do that, I think, becomes incredibly important. And of course, it happens in many different rooms. Power plays out at different levels. It plays out in the global space, if we're talking about trade, for example. It plays out at the very local level, as we've heard in a number of the other case studies. And it also happens in these different rooms in different ways. So who in this room gets invited into the policy development processes? I know many of you in the room, and I know many of you are in that room. And you know that that door is proactively closed to some people, and it's opened to others. So I'm going to give the example of the trade policy discussions. Where's Pat? Pat Ranald. So Pat Ranald heads up AFTINET, the Australian Fair Trade Network, Investment Network. a marvellous success story yesterday with RCIP, one of the big regional trade agreements, and there's a piece of text that's now not going to be in RCIP, which is fantastic. Now, how did Pat and colleagues like Pat advocate for that to happen? How did she get into the spaces that were most effective to get that message through? So she speaks about trade and investment in a particular way. She goes along to the invited stakeholder consultation processes. She hangs out in places that she's not invited to, but she hangs out so that she's there when they come out of those doors, and she just happens to grab them and takes them for a cup of coffee and says, these are the sorts of things that we should be talking about. So understanding that there are many different places and spaces that for us that might be interested, that can happen. And we've got all of the evidence across all of the analysis that colleagues have spoken about to demonstrate that. Because some of the consequences of the imbalances in power, whether it's the structural power, whether it's the instrumental power, whether it's the discursive power, are some of these. So we see the dominant biomedical, we see the dominant economic paradigm play out. We think about the policy discourse, the federal policy discourse right now. We've got a prevention strategy negotiation taking place at the moment, and we are going to have only a focus on the behavioural risk factors, and which will mean we've got a focus on the individual. And that's, I'll come back to that in a second. We see, as a consequence of the power imbalances, we see an absolute deregulation agenda taking place, although I would add a caveat. I think we are incredibly regulated, but we are regulated by private forms of regulation. So be very clear that we are not sitting in this room in an unregulated way. We are sitting in here regulated by private interests. Of course, some of the imbalances in power mean that we keep path dependency. We don't change things very easily. We have this path dependency moving forward. As a consequence, we do nothing. In that policy environment, we do nothing, or we roll back. We've heard again across the case studies. And because of these imbalances in power and different forms of power, we have these, and I've called it the entrenched racist views and practices, but just a whole load of entrenchment of just everything that is so harmful for society in a broad social injustice way. And of course, well, the whole point of power imbalances is to create winners and losers. So, what do we do or what have we learned from the work of the CRE to shift all of that? So this, Belle put this together. This is the learning from the agenda setting programme of work. The power of the evidence, the power of framing strategically. We shop it around. For those of us interested in these issues, you shop it around. You be quite involved in the external and the internal policy processes as much as you can. We build coalitions. We have those unusual bedfellows that help. And then, of course, targeting of the messages. In the pursuit of policy coherence, so what can government do? Then we heard from Catherine about this major structural transformation that's been taking place in South Australia. We think in systems. We have to think about systems level response, get out of the silos, understanding the multi-level and the multi-sectoral governance approaches, and of course at every point call out the policy silences. I think that Catherine's done that beautifully within that programme of work. And then the lessons, I think, from Work Package 3, which was around the implementation, the questions of policy implementation, and I've called it from parchment. You might have a beautiful policy, but in practice it's rubbish. But what Matt and colleagues have demonstrated that actually it's that mixed policy and regulatory design that's so important, with clear agreements, so some of those structural mechanisms that help release the agency of the regional and the local level actors. And then, of course, undermining so much of this is the destabilisation of the public budget. how we change that, I'll leave that to everybody else in this room to work that out. And so finally, of course, all of this is what our evidence is showing us is the importance of it. It's all relational. It's about the relationships and ultimately the political commitment. But what we've seen are those conditions that lead to political commitment. And I would say every single person in this room is here because you're concerned about health equity. Some people are researchers and you're not doing research on the why, you're doing research on the how to make change happen. We have colleagues from government in the room. Sorry, not everybody, of course, is up on this slide. But there are colleagues from government in the room and you're working within those processes, those incremental but incredibly ultimately transformative processes, but doing it in a way that understands the political and policy context. We have colleagues who are NGOs in the room who are working with other colleagues to build those coalitions to advance those sort of core visions together. And then, of course, we have absolute social activists who work in different ways. Apologies to the Critical Policy Reference Group within the CRE. I've got a picture of Peter Sainsbury as our illustration because it's got the health equity warrior that he's got on, and Peter's the chair of the CPRG, but many colleagues are in this room. And this is the last slide because I do think it's just, you might say this is just such a hard agenda. I think what I take away from the CRE and from the networks, the webs of influence that are in this room are these points. We have excellent evidence and analysis done by the CRE, but by many others in this room who understands the systems, who understands the structural drivers, and that we're constantly releasing that sort of evidence. We need, and we've seen a whole spectrum of public interest policy and regulatory designs. We've got a wealth of that within the CRE. We know that, again, the evidence tells us that these organised networks of influence, and here we've got now another network of influence that's about to go out and say change must happen. And of course, the importance of those persuasive strategies and tactics. And there is no one door that should be pushed at. You know, somebody will say, well, what's the 1, 2, 3 things that we should do? And I just think it's the wrong question. I think it's every single door that we can possibly knock on and push through. But the idea is that we're there because we want the public interest to trump the private interest, and we want the social equity interest to trump just the general average. So I think that's what we've learnt from the CRE.
Thank you, Sharon. We do have time for questions, so while you're getting your thoughts in order and preparing your questions, I wanted to pick up sort of the first point, Sharon, and the last point from your presentation in terms of your call that we focus on the how, and then that idea about pushing on every door. And I guess my question is, once we're in the room, once we get through the door, how do we translate those lessons of the past 4 years in those rooms? And what does that look like for the many policy and other actors in this room and beyond? I'm going to stand up here. I'm going to invite Sharon back up to ask questions. Could you indicate your interest in asking a question and we will come to you? And there's some roving mics as well.
Well, maybe people in the audience might reflect actually on Tessa's questions because there are many people in this room who get through those doors. What do you ask for when you're through the door?
I don't think it can be one answer. I think it really depends on who's in the room
and you have to have done the background knowledge to know how to frame it so that there's an opportunity to shape and influence whatever their agenda is. So that would sort of be my response, I think. There's not one answer, but preparation, knowing who's in the room and what ticks their boxes and how to keep the conversation going. And, well, here.
And I think also whether it's representative. You know, if you're looking at the issue, then are the people who it's directly affecting, are they in the room? And things. So I guess that's part of the preparation and thinking through some of those issues.
And if they're not in the room, how do you get them there?
That's right, yep. If they're not in the room, how do you get them there?
Pat, tell us about how you get us progressive trade policy.
Just. Did you mean? Yeah. Okay. I don't think I can presume to tell that story, but I'm Pat Runnell from the Fair Trade Network, and one of the points I would make is that yes, you have to do all that evidence preparation, you have to get into the room, but unless you've got a social movement, unless you represent something, you can't move the politics at the political level. I mean, the reason that in this trade agreement involves India, China, Japan, South Korea, the 10 ASEAN countries, and we have had social movements pushing for this particular change in all of those countries, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And that is what it's been, the Indian social movement putting it on the Indian government's agenda. We've put it on our government's agenda as well, but they can afford to listen less to us. They have to listen to the other governments in the bargaining situation. So unless there are strong represented social movements, it's very hard to get certainly political change in the international trade space.
If you're Pat Runnell, you know more about the topic than the people you're talking to.
Just on the trade and health issue, I think the media has an important role to play too, because until the last few years there's been virtually no media on some of these trade and health issues, and I think the public hasn't been aware of, you know, what are the key issues in relation to trade and health, and, you know, being able to utilise the media in this policy area and others, I think is really important for, you know, influencing politicians, because they're highly responsive to the media as well.
Can I make a comment about the media, and not specifically to trade, but you've heard across all of these different thematic policy issues that we've been speaking about over the course of today, and of course the media picks up on some of them in a reasonably positive way, and some of them in a truly, I mean, in terms of crushing people quite disgracefully. Strategies for engaging with media to how do we help the media frame this, given that they operate within, they're absolutely one of the biggest neoliberal projects that exist, given that they get all the revenue from lifestyle sections. How do we work with the mainstream media, and I'm looking to Melissa, how do we use different forms of media to actually communicate, to frame, to narrate these sorts of issues in a much more effective way? Do people have good news stories, or
Can I abuse position up on the stage? To start with a story that colleagues in the room might want to continue. I mean, I think if you look at what's happened in the Raise the Rate campaign around increasing the New Start allowance, over the past year we've had a phenomenal range of voices of people who've been surviving barely on New Start, telling the story about what that looks like. But that didn't come out of the past 12 months. That came out of in my experience, a decade of work. And where it had to start was a reflection by mostly charitable and non-profit services who were unwilling to put their clients in front of the media because of the risk that that posed to those clients. And that's not an unreasonable concern, but it is also a control of power. And so the willingness of actors in the public policy space, including us, to give up some of that power and to support different voices to come through, to build the storytelling capability, to develop the skills and the trust and the confidence for those other voices. I mean, that's part of in my experience around that campaign particularly, that was part of building the movement. And so, you know, for complex issues and long-term gains, we need complex strategies and long-term solutions.
A thought that's emerged from a couple of the recent questions and responses is I feel there's a sense of accepting power structures as they are in terms of the idea that we're going and knocking on policymakers' doors and things like that. And a takeaway, I guess, with the Uluru Statement discussion and the quote about how having First Nations peoples in Parliament, you know, means that those kind of things might not happen now. Do we need to be a bit more bolder in saying rather than going and seeking audiences with people in positions of power, I don't know, I feel like compared to some other public health kind of oriented things I've been to, this has been quite focused on working within the power structures exist. And maybe I'd also suggest I'm reflecting upon next Friday's the climate strike, which is, you know, a youth-led movement that's turning into a business and adult movement, I guess. So, yeah, in the context of moving forward, I feel like that's a little bit of a takeaway that I've got from this session today. So, was that intentional, or is there scope to maybe do more kind of destabilising those power structures moving forward?
Yeah, we failed if you think we're trying to work within the existing power structures. Absolutely not. I think what a lot of the work, I hope, was conveying was, so there's a recognition of within the current structural arrangements, there are things that can be done. Yeah, and so we've unpacked some of that through some of the case studies. But the discussion, and particularly, I think, within the agenda setting work, and then in the session and closing the gap, that is about changing, so using different forms of power among, and the release of agency among different groups of actors to create the sorts of structural changes that are needed. So what we've done, I suppose, is shine a light on the existing structural arrangements and the power dynamics within that in order to understand the mechanisms and the conditions via which change can happen, that has happened through that retrospective analysis, so that going forward we do exactly that sorts of disruption that would be absolutely necessary. But if you think of the climate movement that's taking place, so there you've got a swell, a bottom-up movement through the climate youth movement particularly, but it's wrapped right around a whole load of activities that are happening within governments around the world as well. So what the climate movement is doing, I would say, is very similar to the sorts of things that we want to see within the health equity work. We just don't have the sorts of numbers out on the street about these health inequities. That's a question for this community. Why don't we have people tearing down buildings or being so outraged that the level of social injustice that exists within the world and within Australia is causing the sorts of inequities that we see in the way. So it looks slightly different, I think, within the climate space, but it's actually still trying to do the same thing. We want to disrupt the existing structural arrangements that are creating the inequitable conditions that are causing the climate outcomes, that are causing the health outcomes, that are causing the inequity outcomes. So, but that's a very important reflection from you that we might need to communicate this a bit differently.
We might also need to make sure that we don't take over other people's space. So one of the anxieties I have about all of us oldies jumping on the youngsters on the climate change protests next Friday is that, of course, this is youngsters wanting to express their views about, and in doing so, they're much more likely to be disruptive because they will do what they will do. But if we get in there and start to control it all for them, then in fact there's a very high risk that we will be tempted to take over, and all of the parental controls will suddenly emerge in trying to force people to do things the way that we think is proper and right. And I guess it goes to Tessa's point about the importance of giving people voice, and the importance of not taking people's voice from them and taking over from them, but in fact working with them to help them amplify the reality of their life experience, because you can't fight with that in a political context. When someone stands up in front of you and says, "This is my life," you have no option but to accept and embrace that. So in fact, I think it is one of the things that we need to really look hard at. How do we join with people without taking over from them? And for all the rest of you in the room that haven't signed on to the Raise the Rate campaign, shame on you. And if you haven't, it's really easy. Just get on the bloody ACOS website and do it. And do something more than that, because it's an appalling situation that we leave. And if you wanted to do anything about poverty and inequity in Australia today, one of the most powerful things we could do is to get that allowance up by at least $75 a week. It would change the shape of poverty in Australia overnight.
Well, on that note, we are at time, but it's actually a perfect segue to the final session for today, which is going to be hearing from and thinking about the role of civil society in enabling healthy and equitable societies. So pause any thoughts in train, bring them back in 15 minutes. We have 15 minutes only for afternoon tea. And before we break, can I just share my huge congratulations to the CRE for Health Equity. It's been just a phenomenal day, giving you just a sort of high-level set of insights into the volume of work and insight that has been generated. And so we'd really love to hear from people in the next session what we can all do to take those insights forward and to continue to push for both healthy and equitable societies.